Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever it is, depending on who you are and where you are. I'm Chase Cunningham, Dr. Cunningham, if you want to be formal, Dr. Zero Trust, if you're listening to all this internet stuff. Anyway, I have Tim Youngblood here from Astrix. Tim, if you wouldn't mind, give a background on kind of who you are and what you do for Astrix.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a little bit of background on myself. I'm Tim Youngblood. I've been in cyber for about 25, 30 years. I've been the CISO for four major brands, Dell, Kimberly-Clark Corporation, McDonald's, and T-Mobile. And in addition to being a CISO, I'm also an angel investor and board member, and now working with Astrix as their CISO in resident, which is basically a industry advocate on this critical problem called non-human identities.
Well, I mean, you've definitely got the battle scars from doing the work that you've done around those major brands. That's impressive. And I want to start off let's go ahead and define what NHI is because it's kind of a newish term, and I understand what it is, and I know the criticality of it. But just for the folks that may not have been paying attention for the last X number of years, can you sort of define what NHI is in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, NHI is somewhat of a new term, and actually, Astrix helped coin that term with the help of Gartner, and it's machine to machine identities, right, which are a necessary evil in environments today. So think service and process accounts, think API keys, think secrets, OAuth, webhooks, these things that basically are the connective glue to internal and external services for the enterprise, right? They allow, a company to have an ecosystem of apps talk to each other so that they can conduct, some type of transaction. And they're very easy to deploy and quick time to value, low overhead. And just think of this, there's for every 1,000 employee accounts, there's over 20,000 non-human identities that are out there. So it's a huge, huge footprint.
I mean, that's the scale of that is mind-boggling when you think about it. Because I mean, I'm one guy with my own LLC, and I have hundreds of accounts. I can't even imagine how many NHIs are out there. I mean, what was the last one we had where there was? I think there was roughly 8 billion people on the planet, but there was 23 billion usernames and passwords. I mean, what does NHI take that to the next decimal level?
Yeah, easily. Even just think of my time as the CISO for McDonald's. We had 2.2 million people that work for McDonald's globally, and wow. Just imagine, the number of non-human identities that were in my environment.
So when we're thinking about NHI, where it seems like such an insurmountable problem. I mean, when we're talking about the scope and scale of something at that level, what's the way to address it? And I mean, I know I'm leading the witness a bit here, but where do you go and how do you do this first? Programmatically, strategically, what's the approach to a problem that big?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And I think with the evolution of cloud and now, most enterprises, having multiple cloud presences, I don't know anyone who doesn't have at least two, if not all three of the major cloud providers in their environment. And it's just an issue that's sort of compounded itself in being able to, again, kind of connect the glue across the board. And the first, thing that you have to do, just like with drinking problems, you have to identify you have a problem, right? Step up and admit that. And, once you do that, you have to understand, okay, where are these things at? Where do I take inventory? Where are they within all of the clouds that I'm in? Where are they within my SaaS providers? Where are they on-prem? And you have to go through a process of establishing where is, these assets, which they are at the end of the day, where are they? And then who has access to them and what are they doing and why are they here?
So we start with I mean, this sounds eerily familiar, right? Because we talk about this in ZT all the time as far as know what's going on and then where you go from there and plot, plan, scheme, and strategize. When we're looking at this, how do you deal with the kind of burstability and dynamic side of the infrastructure, right? Because now we have Kubernetes and all these ways to burst stuff up and bring it down. It seems like it's trying to hit a moving target while balancing on a ball in the middle of the ocean. It is incredibly difficult, is it not?
Yeah, it's incredible because a lot of these types of accounts are dynamically created. You don't even know they're being created, right? And to your point, you're spinning up, workloads up and down, and sometimes they create, some form of identity that needs to connect into a SaaS platform that you got, and then we also have third parties that create these, accounts that need to be part of their platform, but they don't necessarily describe that as you've gone through the deployment of it. And it really requires you to have some form of governance, just like you have over other things, right? So what's the governance around this? What are the policies and rules that are acceptable and not acceptable in our environment, right? And then how do I have a way of sort of prioritizing and defining which actually cause me risk, right? Because there's more there than I can actually manage at any one point, but I need to know the ones that cause me the most pain. And so I need a process to identify how I prioritize that and how I'm going to go after it.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those times where, like, literally the only way to deal with this scope of a problem is with technology. Like, you can't do this at that scale with Ricky the intern and a bunch of spreadsheets, correct?
It's a heavy human burden if you're going to try to do this manually. You absolutely can try. But I've been through that process before. I've had my own form of NHI issues in previous environments and I've had teams of folks from identity, from IT operations, development teams, all going in and doing manual cleanup, and they'll go through that process. It may be successful in a 3-month cycle, but in the 4th month the problem comes back again.
Yeah, it's not static. It doesn't stay. I mean, this is the problem that's not even, you could say, not even linear. I mean, it is, you're dealing with like many different moving parts, and it's not a binary sort of straight line issue. How do we deal with the issue about the developer side of this equation? Because devs want to use every resource they can get. If it's quicker, better, faster, and they can make a better mousetrap, they're going to leverage it. Like, where's the sanity check that has to happen there? Because that concerns the hell out of me. Like, if I was trying to run an org and we're building apps and we're shipping code, or someone is, the use of these types of things is increasingly concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. And developers are going to take the easiest route possible. They're kind of like honey badgers, right? So they will figure out a way, to make their lives easier. And you have to understand this is the same kind of evolution we went through with DevOps, and then instituting Sec into DevOps, and understanding, okay, what are really the required dynamic configurations you need to get your job done, right? And how do we make sure we make that secure so that it's secure by design? And how do we ensure we have our own policy enforcement, and that you as a development team are supporting a zero trust concept, right? And that whenever you are using things like secrets, that you don't hard code them into the code, right? That you have some type of repository that you're leveraging that is approved, and it doesn't slow you down, but it makes it secure by deployment, which is where we want them to be. And a lot of this is education. Most developers will do the right thing when educated appropriately, but left to their own devices, you're going to get what you get.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess having run the organizations at that like size that you have, how do you get people to align to, like, this is how we do business here, or this is the way that we're going to approach it? Because I mean, I think just my experience, like, if we've tried to train them and teach them uh, ability to hold them to account, it really kind of is all for naught. Because like you said, eventually they're going to honey badger their way around this thing. Like, as soon as they can figure out to dig a hole under the fence, they'll dig a hole up under the fence.
Yeah. There's this old saying. I think Reagan and Gorbachev had this: trust but verify. My particular point of view was no, untrust and verify, right? So I don't trust you. Let's verify this. So, and which is why it's really important to have tools that kind of support that enforcement, right? Because they're just, even if it's purposeful or a legitimate mistake, people are going to make them. And how do you make sure you have the warning signs and the monitoring around these types of accounts to know, when they're not being used appropriately or when they've been exposed. You have take a token, right? That's all of a sudden that's been integrated in and it's been exposed out, to the internet, and now it's vulnerable, right? It might not have been vulnerable before that deployment, but it's absolutely vulnerable now. And the only way you do that is to have some active, proactive monitoring around these types of accounts and when people use them.
Yeah, it's really always sort of one of these weird things, just in my experience, where there's the need to move bits and bytes and to keep the business going, and then there's like, well, where do we intersect the problem and stay ahead of it and potentially cause some friction? But I don't think that it's really a valid excuse anymore with technology done correctly that the developer and the software process is going to be made miserable by security controls. Like they should be in parallel, correct?
Yeah, this should be just a natural part of what you do, right? And why it's also important to have tools that support that, that are not going to slow you down. They're not going to, institute, some additional intrusive scanning, something that is actually kind of integrated into your workflow, and just works, right? And just something that is going to happen in the background. And, if you do something that's kind of out of the normal process, it's going to tell you, okay, you just made that mistake, get quickly back into the normal process, right? And you continue with your work, and you're not caught up in some crazy compliance loop that you can never get out of. And I've seen tools do that to teams before, and they get frustrated, and then that's really when they become the honey badger.
Yeah, you get stuck in that seventh circle of hell, like Dante's Inferno, and compliance is somewhere in there. I think it's maybe the fifth or seventh level, one of the two. It gets miserable quick. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question from somebody with your experience at that level. What's your view on the whole zero trust conversation? Is it just marketing BS? Is it really a thing? Do you see like the strategy side? Like if I put you in a room and said, tell me what you think about ZT, what would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've been talking about zero trust since the 2010s, right? So and it all goes back to remember this breach that was very public with Google, the Aurora breach, right? That occurred, and then you also had Forrester kind of released a white paper that was around zero trust. So all this happened around the same time, right? And I think people were, for years kind of struggling, like, okay, this all sounds great, but how do I execute it? And then there was this assumption that, oh, well, if I get a product, that'll get me to zero trust, right? A CASB, right? That's zero trust, isn't it? And then quickly come to find out, no, it's a lot more than that, right? It's not just trying to figure out what's going on your network layer, but it's also, what's happening at the app layer, what's going on with identity. I mean, all these things that really lead people to understand that zero trust is a philosophy and not a product, right? And you got to get to a point where you understand what the concept of that philosophy is, and as you're working through your stack, what supports it and what doesn't.
What's your view when you hear people say, "Oh, it's just a marketing buzzword"? Like, is it? My view on it is, number one, they probably don't really understand what they're talking about, and then I think that strategy is strategy all day. I don't care if you call it cyber tiddlywinks, as long as you have the strategy that approach to the problem. But for you, being a CISO from like major organizations, if somebody says zero trust is just a marketing buzzword, your knee-jerk response would be what?
Yeah, and I would say to that it's definitely been used as a marketing buzzword, and there's plenty of vendors out there that will lead with, if you want zero trust, get my product, and they would be misleading you. And the reality is, you got to kind of educate yourself. I talked about that white paper that Forrester released, several years ago, back in the 2010s. It's still relevant today, right?
Yeah.
Go back and look at that. Or look at some of the stuff that the Cloud Security Alliance is doing today, because they've gone real big on zero trust and zero trust in the cloud. And anybody that hasn't educated themselves right now is going to become a victim of a vendor at the end of the day, right? And whatever people think will sell, they will say. But whatever you understand that drives a sustainable, effective program is what you go out and you learn for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, strategy is strategy. There's physics of problems. You try and work with those, and if there's I used to get really like irked about all the marketing shtick that went on with Zero Trust. Now I'm like, okay, you know what? It's that much market because it is a viable thing. So my opinion is in line with yours. I think that that's really where folks like. God forbid you educate yourself and read up on all the research around it. Like,
Right,
I
right. And
mean,
there's an old joke, Chase. What's the difference between a used car salesman and a software vendor? The used car salesman knows he's lying, right? So
that's a good one. I've never heard that, but I totally love that one. Yeah. Yeah. I think that and it's just kind of weird because folks will say, well, can I do zero trust with open source? Sure, you could. It's going to be miserable and you could align with that. But I mean, you could dig the Suez Canal with a shovel. It would suck, but it's possible. I mean,
yeah,
tools and technology are here to do things at scope and scale. I think vendors have a valid claim if they say what problem they solve in ZT. I mean, that's just my thought.
yeah. And I think, for years and years we've talked about defense in depth, and how important that is. And this is just kind of another protective layer that you kind of build throughout your stack, and you understand how you're supporting the ability of people or entities within your environment to have access to things that they're allowed to, and things that they shouldn't have access to.
Yeah, and I mean at the fundamental level too, it's kind of crazy when folks say, "Oh, well, we don't know how to solve this problem," and it's whatever else. And you look at 10 years worth of research and Verizon, Dibber, and all these other things, and it's like usernames, passwords, and links in phishing emails. Like that is 90% of the problem. Solve those, and then now that you have NHI, you've got to. That's an interesting twist on that whole problem space because there's never a human that's going to be the thing that's using that credential or whatever. It's a machine, and those machines do what they're told.
Yeah, yeah,
That's where it goes horribly awry if you get it wrong.
yeah, absolutely. And that's one of those things that if you don't understand what the behaviors are that are normal for these kind of identities, then when they become abnormal, you have no idea that that's happened. And it feels like we're back in this era. I remember back in 2012 or so, I had deployed McAfee throughout my entire environment. I was a CISO at Dell at that time. I was very proud that that was out, across 100,000 workstations. And then we did a pilot of FireEye, and I realized, holy crap, this thing is missing 40% of the malware in the environment, right? Like it was the biggest eye-opening thing, my eyes. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You got to do something about it. And I think this is another one of those areas, right? Because, with just this expansion in cloud and SaaS efforts, and the fact that, you've got all these quick ways to kind of connect these systems together, it's created another one of those moments.
Yeah, I mean we've not learned from our past experience that this just keeps getting like technology, Moore's law, and all those things. It gets quicker, better, faster, but also the problem space gets quicker, worse, faster, which is an issue there. So, in line with that, like one of the question I had in my notes here was really, does ignoring NHI invalidate a company's security posture or compliance sort of certification? Because I was reading through some of the line item requirements for some of these compliance things, and like technically, if you had one NHI piece of infrastructure doing things that weren't monitored, measured, controlled, or whatever, that could invalidate your entire security posture for compliance. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you look at things like PCI, you look at GLBA, you look GDPR. I mean, all of them allude to having, control over identities. They don't specifically call out non-human identities, but they are talking about identities in your environment, which would be inclusive of it. So, and it's kind of an unfortunate thing because when you look at some of these assessors and auditors, they don't understand how to look for these things yet, right? And they're getting better at that, and that's coming. And I think that will create the exposure. Like they've been looking at service and process accounts for years, and they know that space really well. And now they're at a point now where they kind of need to be educated on this. This is another type of identity in the environment that, just like service and process accounts, can be abused.
Yeah, it's a point of note. Like I don't understand how some of these orgs can kind of just turn a blind eye, and they tout their compliance initiatives all over their web pages and whatever else. And I'm sitting here on the back going like, I know for a fact you've got stuff that is bouncing around you're unaware of. Like your compliance should be written on toilet paper. I don't really get why it's invalidated. I mean, if you're not taking care of the many moving parts, you're missing something.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't been in a round table and I've asked this question. I was like, who is comfortable that they have complete control over every machine to machine or non-human identity in their environment? And no one ever raises their hand, right? No one ever raises their hand because they already know they have an issue with service processing. They have an audit finding around that every year. And God forbid if people start looking at all the other accounts, the secrets and the tokens and OAuth, that would expose the whole, sort of illusion that I am in compliance with things.
Yeah, I think it'd be very interesting if orgs if they had to submit those gaps to like some big audit sort of side of it and say this is, and it's all collated. Like I think it would boggle people's mind to really realize just how out of control that problem is for many orgs.
Well, and I strongly believe that this is the biggest blind spot in cybersecurity, hands down. There's plenty of things that are obvious things that, shops need to work at. But, just go and ask, Microsoft, Midnight Blizzard, exposed OAuth token. You look at Cloudflare, they had, their issues with service process accounts. They thought they cleaned it all up, but they left a few hundred out there, just enough. Even the New York Times and their issues with, over permission in GitHub. So it's definitely rising to a favorite vehicle for threat actors. And it's just a matter of time before they get to you.
Yeah, I mean APIs are the way things connect now. Like I think APIs honestly are like the new kind of network. I know that sounds kind of dumb, but that's what they are. Like they're connecting stuff, and then NHIs and credentials and machines and bursts and all that stuff. It's almost an entirely not new, but an entirely developing threat space, and it's where bad guys go because it's low hanging fruit. I mean, why do hard stuff when those are there?
Absolutely. I've never known a threat actor to try to do something complicated, right? So, it's going to be whatever the easiest pathway is to get me in, and then I'll figure out the rest from there.
Yeah, and creds are great, especially tokens that don't expire because once you're there, you're there, and I mean that's living off the land as long as you can do it. So, problematic. So I always like to keep things moving because you got other stuff to do. But lastly, I wanted to talk about Astrix and this NHI security conference that's coming up in New York. Are you going to be there? Like, what's the whole kick of it? I'm going to be there, and not that anyone wants to come see me blather on, but like from folks like you that actually do the work, what's the crux of this event?
Yeah, this is really exciting because we're going to be in New York, Manhattan. The heartbeat of the finance for the world, and it is going to be the first non-human identity summit that's ever been created. And we're excited to bring this topic to the table with dozens and dozens of CISOs that'll be there. Provide some education on some of the risk that they need to be aware of. Give them some concepts on what you can do to get started, even, right? So not to get overwhelmed, because I don't know a CISO that says, oh yeah, this is on my roadmap for this year, right? So it's not, but there's some things you can do to get started so you can go full-fledged into it the next cycle. And so we'll talk about that. And then we've got some really great speakers that are going to be there. And we've got some fireside chats that are with some industry leaders like yourself. This is going to be really, I think, a reflective moment when we look back on this in the past that, okay, I can't believe we never had sessions dedicated to this before, right? So it's just, it's really iconic that it's going to start, in New York, and then I see this thing growing, tremendously from there.
Yeah, it's an important problem. I can see developers getting in on this and those types of folks, and even compliance and even maybe some of the insurance side of it too. So this is Astrix Security's got this going on. I've got the ticker running here at the bottom. It's NHI-security.com for that event coming up. It's going to be September 18th in New York City. I believe it's at Freedom Tower, which is a pretty cool spot to have an event. I'm I'm such a bad like New York traveler because I'm a country guy. Like every time I go there, I got to get the hell out. But Freedom Tower was one of the places I've wanted to go. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to have a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I am too. I haven't been there, so I'm really excited about being.
Yeah, it'll be a cool experience if nothing else. So if you're available and you're listening to this, come check that out because, like Tim said, it's going to be people that actually do the work and are talking about real solutions to real problems. So last thing I always like to leave with: if you were going to tell somebody one thing not to do, what would you say? Don't do this, because maybe it's don't ignore the problem or something. But from Tim Youngblood, like, what's one thing not to do?
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of this old sort of story about the farmer and the squirrel. And I don't know if you ever heard this story, but there was this farmer had a beautiful, beautiful, farmland, one of the best in land. He had a huge oak tree, biggest in the county there. And he's out in his garden one morning, and he looks up and he sees a squirrel go into what he thinks is a hole. He goes, "Wow, I never noticed that before." And he goes, "Man, I wonder how hollow that is." So he goes up and looks at the tree, and sure enough, the tree is hollow from the very rim all the way up to the top of it. And he steps back and looks at this like, "Wow, if I cut this tree down, it's surely going to land all over my crop and leave me penniless." And then he goes, "Well, if I don't do anything, we're coming up on storm season. This thing could be blown over and right through my house and, kill my family or something." So he walks back to his porch and he puts his hands in his head and he goes, "Why did I see that damn squirrel?" So, and basically what that means is once you know you got this problem, you got to do something about it. Don't ignore it.
That is huge. Love the story. That makes so much sense. I think that's awesome. So, all right. So, folks, like on this one, you heard about the NHI stuff. You got to talk to a guy that's been a 4-time CISO, and we learned about the value of not seeing squirrels. You've got to understand what's going on. So, and whether or not you're liable for that problem. So, Tim, I can't thank you enough for coming on here. Folks, reach out to Tim. He knows what he's talking about. He's done the work. He's led the teams. And if you have any other questions about this, Astrix, Astrix.security, they're doing a bunch of good work. And hopefully, if you're around New York in September, come say hi.
Awesome.